There are two ways that organisms can reproduce. Both of them involve cellular division and replication of DNA. One of them is done through mitosis. Now, mitosis is essentially making an exact duplicate, a copy of the genetic material, and then dividing the cell in half. Now, we could put a little asterisk by that term exact copy because there are still mistakes and still mutations that occur during mitosis. All bacteria, for instance, reproduce via mitosis. Most asexual reproducing organisms also use mitosis. The other main type of cellular division is called meiosis. This should be reviewed for you back to high school biology. Meiosis involves making a duplicate of the genetic material in a cell, but dividing it basically in half, so that when you fuse two meiotic cell products, an egg and a sperm, pollen and an ovule, when they fuse together, they get back to the original number. And that is sexual reproduction. So meiosis is basically the cellular division that leads to gametes as part of sexual reproduction. So just be aware of those two reproductive strategies. We're going to spend most of this discussion talking about asexual reproduction. Now, before we do that, and just kind of as a foundation, as beginning, let's define ethology. Ethology is very broadly just the study of animal behavior. And one large subcategory within ethology is sexual reproduction. That is the behaviors, the structures, the morphologies that occur because organisms reproduce sexually. Now, I put this picture just here as an illustration. Konrad Lorenz was a very famous, in fact, one of the pioneering ethologists, and he was interested in mother and offspring behavior, particularly in birds, and how birds would bind or bond with their mother. And so here he is studying cygnets, I think they are, or goslings, baby swans or baby geese. I think they're baby geese. And he was basically their mother and studying their behavior and raising them and looking to see how their behavior was impacted by the things he did or how much they had, they were born with, how much instinctual stuff there was. Now that's not relating directly to sexual reproduction, but it's just an illustration of ethology. And so we're going to just study and talk about in this class that subcategory of ethology that has to do with reproduction. Now, before we do that, I'd like to talk about asexual reproduction. The SLO says what are the two main types of asexual reproduction, and it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. So maybe put a little star by that or cross it out and say there are really more than two. But you could say there's asexual reproduction that results in exact or nearly exact copies. And then there are forms of asexual reproduction where we can have a little bit of change or recombination prior to making an offspring. And so although offspring only come from a single parent, still asexual, they don't need two parents. The offspring are only a portion of that parent's genetic material. And there are multiple ways that that can be accomplished, but basically they're not exact clones or exact replicates of the parent. Okay? These first five that we have listed here, the first four, are essentially very simple, straightforward, mitotic versions of asexual reproduction, where the result is an exact clone or genetic copy of the parent. Okay, so budding, as pictured here in this hydra with the little offspring coming off the end, is basically a rapid mitotic growth and then cellular differentiation from that growth, and then the new organism separates from the parent. So imagine you have a little growth on your side. It starts growing, eventually you get head, eyes, arms, and then it falls off and a little you runs away. Now, that's unusual in animals, although in simple animals like the cnidaria it does occur. It's quite common in many plants. Many plants will send off buds that can then either on their own or with the help of a human be separated from the plant and establish their own genetic clone of the original plant. Fission is what occurs in bacteria and also many single-celled protozoa like this amoeba. And in fission, essentially, we get a splitting in half of a cell. So a cell grows, gets larger, the DNA replicates, nucleus splits, cell splits, boom, you have two offspring, and both of them are basically composed of half of the original cell's material. So we really don't have a parent and an offspring in fission. We just have two daughter cells, they're called, that were each equally taken from the parental cell. Okay. Fragmentation occurs in many plants, also in some animals like starfish, and fragmentation, as the name implies, means that if you break an organism into multiple pieces, some organisms then have the ability to grow back and have fully functional organisms from those individual pieces, depending on the amount that's broken off. Vegetative growth is most common in plants, but happens in fungi and other groups also, and it's basically where you send a structure out like a root, for instance, and then a new organism folds. So if you break up many plants' roots, they will still sprout up vegetatively from those roots. Now, all four of those are forms of asexual reproduction. Agamogenesis essentially means reproducing with a gamete, but only one gamete. So basically with just an egg. You don't need sperm. And there are many species that reproduce through agamogenesis. Now, there are many kinds of agamogenesis. Some of them, like parthenogenesis, are actually exact clones or direct copies. The mothers lay eggs that don't need to be fertilized, and the babies are genetic clones of the mother. And there are entire species that do that. Finally, apomixis, and we could actually add, there's other subcategories and special groups, but it gets complicated, and apomixis is the last one that you need to know. So apomixis is a form of agamogenesis, only mothers, no fathers in those species. But in apomixis, there can be some genetic mixing. And so there's another type sometimes called automixis, where again, there's some recombination genetic mixing. And there are different varieties of this with somewhat technical names. And I don't care, don't spend time looking at this and memorizing how these occur, but just look how you could have different outcomes from a parent. So in this first one, we have a duplication of the genetic material. Then, almost like meiosis phase 1, it splits in half, and then each of those would then reduplicate. So we would then have another duplication event to make a fully formed offspring. In terminal fusion, we would just have two of the gametes fuse back together. It's still not sexual reproduction because both these gametes come from the same individual. And then there are other kind of central fusion types that can lead to more diversity and variety. Now, even though automixis creates a little bit of genetic diversity, more so than just simple budding or fusion or parthenogenesis or any one of those that result in a genetic copy with only a rare new mutation, there is more diversity for automixis, but it's nowhere near the amount of recombination diversity that can be created during meiosis or sexual reproduction. Okay? So, sexual reproduction is pictured here. You guys don't need to worry about it. There are two key elements here that show the amount of diversity, and we talked about this in a very early lecture, so let's just review it very quickly. So the first is random assortment. So notice here during metaphase 1 that we have mom's chromosomes and dad's chromosomes can line up on either side like flipping a coin. So that creates many different possible combinations just by random assortment. And then also as pictured here at the blue and red coloring in these chromosomes is that there can be crossing over. That's another form of recombination, and so you can end up with myriads. We talked about how it's actually more than 17 trillion different combinations just from random assortment of human chromosomes. So it creates massive amounts of mixing and matching and diversity in the gametes. Okay, so that's meiosis. It's just the genetic beginning, the genetic form of sexual reproduction. Now, bacteria do not reproduce sexually, so this is just here to remind us. However, they do have the possibility for frequent horizontal gene transfer by a couple of different mechanisms, 3 actually, so 3 different mechanisms. And so although bacteria do not undergo sexual reproduction, they do create more genetic diversity and more genetic combinations in their genome based on this horizontal gene transfer, which is quite frequent. So, if you wanted to recognize or determine whether or not a species was sexually reproducing, for most species it's fairly easy. Many species have fairly significant sexual dimorphism, where the males look different than the females. So it's not hard to tell, at least at the adult stage, male mountain gorilla from a female mountain gorilla, or a elephant seal male from a elephant seal female. And even if they look somewhat similar, a little bit of a closer inspection, mostly with most species you can see externally, but with some like birds, fish, it might be a little trickier, and you may even have to look internally to get 100% verification of males versus females in sexually reproducing species. So we recognize that most sexually reproducing species by the differences, the morphological differences, sometimes quite extreme and sometimes more subtle. But that's how we can recognize sexually reproducing species. But that does not work all the time. So, for instance, let's say that you were exploring the jungle and you went out and you'd done a bunch of collecting, and you bring back all your samples and you begin to sort them out, and you find 20 beetles that all look like they're female, and they're all from the same species. And you look and look and look, but you can't find any males. And this is actually not that uncommon of an event. And so you don't know whether you have a biased sample, like maybe males were not around or weren't in the areas or were captured by the methods you were using. So you don't know if you have a biased sample of a sexually reproducing species, or if it is a gamogenetic or maybe parthenogenetic, right? So a species that's entirely female and has no males and reproduces asexually. So in that circumstance, there is a surefire way that you could look at their genes and determine whether or not they were sexually reproducing or asexually reproducing. If they were asexually reproducing, then you would expect the nuclear genome, which is inherited from both parents in sexually reproducing populations, but only from the mother in these parthenogenetic populations. And you would expect the pattern of relationships in the nuclear DNA to match or nearly match the pattern in the mitochondrial relationships. So that's an asexual mode of reproduction. If, however, there's not strong matching, they mix and match and switch around, that's a sign that sexual reproduction has occurred, and this is recombination. So if you did a phylogeny of the beetles that you discovered in the rainforest using nuclear DNA and found it did not match the phylogeny made from the mitochondrial DNA, then you would know that it's sexually reproducing, and you would need to maybe re-examine your samples. Maybe the male just looks so different that you didn't originally place them with the female and match them together. Or perhaps there was some bias in your sample, and so even though males are present at some point in the population, you just didn't collect any. So looking for that phylogenetic match between mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA can be a signal for an asexual reproducing population. And that's really a great surefire one, particularly if you have a limited sample size and maybe it's prohibitive, expensive, time-consuming to go and gather more data to determine whether or not it's sexual or asexual. So there are numerous species that reproduce asexually, some maybe that you didn't even suspect. In fact, about the only exception to this rule are mammals. As far as we know, there are no asexually reproducing mammals. We've never had instances. There have been some kind of spurious tales without good evidence that most of them have been overturned, or the data is very, very fragmentary and weak. So as far as we know, no mammals can reproduce asexually. But just about every other major group of organism has at least some asexual reproducers. And there are entire groups of organisms, like bacteria, of course, many of the protozoans, that can only reproduce asexually. But here are just some pictures of some asexual species. Most of these are parthenogenetic. They have only females in the species, no males at all, and the females just lay fertile eggs. Some of them go through apomixis or other slight forms of recombination, but still all of the genetic material for the offspring comes from a single parent with no contribution from a second parent. So in asexual species, we've got mollusks here, the snails and clams, some vertebrates, although it's a little bit more rare in vertebrates, but there are fish that do it, there are lizards that do it. I don't know of birds. I need to double check. I don't know if there are any asexual birds. They might be a rule breaker also. I'll check on that and get back to you. Lots of arthropods, so insects, mites, many insects. Lots of plants actually reproduce only asexually. And then many other, these are rotifers, a group of phyla of animals. Many other groups have wholly or partially asexually reproducing species. So it's not an uncommon thing. Now, in the next chapter, we'll discuss the benefits of reproducing sexually, how it evolved, because all the earliest species, including the prokaryotes, were asexual reproducers. And sexual reproduction didn't evolve until at least a couple billion years into the history of life on Earth. So we'll look at that, and we'll look at its advantages and why it's been kept, and why so many large species, especially multicellular species, why they reproduce sexually.